We're comparing the cameras on the iPhone 14 Pro with those on the iPhone 13 Pro. Why? Well, because the iPhone 14 Pro has a completely new camera system over older phones, including a brand new 48 megapixel sensor, as well as the new A16 Bionic chip, new features like action mode, and a new selfie camera. But like me, you might be wondering, what big of a difference does the new hardware and software actually make? Now, I know most people aren't upgrading their phones every year, but I still thought it would be fun to see how much or maybe how little of a difference there is between the two camera systems. And as always, everything you see in this comparison has been shot on one of the two phones straight from the camera with zero edits applied, unless I say otherwise. And this comparison would be exactly the same regardless of whether I used the 14 Pro Max and the 13 Pro Max, because the camera systems are actually identical to that on the regular Pro models. They're just bigger phones. Okay, let's see the photos.
Like all comparisons, personal preference plays a big part in all this, plus the screen you're viewing on does make a difference. Let's look at that main wide-angle camera first. Hardware-wise, this is the biggest change because the 14 Pro has that new 48 megapixel sensor. The 13 Pro uses a 12 megapixel sensor. We'll talk about the 48 megapixel shots in a moment, but by default, the 14 Pro takes 12 megapixel images using a technique called pixel binning. So we're comparing apples to apples with these images, and as you can see so far in good light, results are pretty similar. It's hard to tell the difference between these shots if you're looking at them at a reduced magnification. But it's when you push in a little bit that the advantages of those pixel binned images appear on the 14 Pro. The tree trunks are more defined and sharper than those on the 13 Pro, and so too are areas of fine detail like the grass. The 14 Pro's lens also has a wider field of view than the 13 Pro at 24 versus 26 millimeters. Now that means you can get a little bit more in your shot, which might be especially helpful for things like landscapes. And you can see in most of these side-by-sides, the perspective is a little bit wider on the 14 Pro because of that lens. The 14 Pro also has another trick up its sleeve, as that 48 megapixel sensor can also let you take 12 megapixel shots at effectively 2 times zoom, just by cropping into that higher resolution image. So you'll get some more flexibility with focal length even without a fourth lens. Both the phones support Apple's Photographic Styles, or a preset look to your images you can customize. Now this is different to a filter because it lets you see the effect before you take the photo, and it identifies and applies local edits. And let's talk about RAW files for a second. You can take ProRAW photos on both, which gives you more scope to make non-destructive edits or recover detail from things like clipped highlights or shadow detail. If you select RAW mode on the 14 Pro, it takes the full 48 megapixel photo on the main camera. And let me warn you, those files are big, and they can get to over 100 megabytes each, depending on the amount of detail in your shot. So I really hope you bought that higher capacity phone. But the results are absolutely worth it and really show off the sensor's dynamic range. They also take more time to capture and process, as you'd expect, so it's not as fast to snap them as regular 12 megapixel images. Next, let's look at the telephoto cameras. Both phones go to 3 times optical zoom at f2.8, and they look pretty similar. If you really want to split hairs, the 14 Pro is a tiny bit sharper at full magnification. If you need to get closer, both of the phones have digital zoom. Here is the 10 times comparison, which is okay, I guess, if you have enough light, and both go to a maximum 15 times. And real talk, neither will look great here, but the 14 Pro does look a little bit more true to life with a touch more detail rather than that kind of painterly, smudgy effect from the 13 Pro. Looking at photos from the ultra-wide, I really can't spot many differences at all between the two. Now both are capturing at 12 megapixels and really look strikingly similar. If anything, I would say the 14 Pro has a bit more contrast on the default photographic style here, and I actually kind of prefer the less contrasty look from the older phone in this situation. Both can also take macro photos by leveraging autofocus on the ultra-wide camera. Now you'll get the best results when there's enough light on your subject and it stays still, and you can get as close as 2 centimeters from your subject. This will automatically switch from the wide camera to the ultra-wide once you move in.
For selfies, the front-facing camera on the iPhone 14 Pro has been upgraded with a faster maximum aperture of f1.9 and the added bonus of having autofocus compared to not having autofocus on the 13 Pro. Does it really make a huge difference, especially when it comes to having multiple people in the frame? Well, I think it's a pretty subtle difference, as you can see here in the side-by-side, but it definitely does help with things like group selfies.
Hi, Mom!
For still photos on the front cameras, I find photos taken on the newer phone look better overall than the 13 Pro. They have less of that yellow tinge that some older iPhones can capture on the front camera. There's better definition, and because the aperture is faster, you'll generally be able to capture slightly better results in low light too. For portrait mode, there's not much difference really between the two phones in terms of edge detection, but the 14 Pro does tend to brighten the image a little bit more. The 14 Pro also lets you take portrait photos at 2x zoom rather than the 1x or 3x only on the 13 Pro, and I think that 2x is kind of a nice sweet spot. If you want to nitpick, I'd say a little bit more of the image stays sharp on the newer phone, especially here on this photo of my puppy. Time for low light images first, then we'll talk about night mode specifically. So the iPhone 14 Pro has a new image processing pipeline to help improve medium to low light shots, and combined with the larger sensor, I can see the difference in this shot at dusk, specifically when you look at the detail captured on the tree branches by the skyline. The newer phone also has slightly better noise reduction in low light without night mode active. And I also find dynamic range is better in low light too, capturing more shadow and highlight detail than the older phone. Now for night mode shots specifically, both the phones use pretty similar exposure times ranging from 1 to 3 seconds depending on the lighting conditions. And on this shot, it definitely does not look dark enough to trigger night mode, but trust me, it was way darker to my eye than the camera makes it look, which is the beauty of night mode really. The 14 Pro image has more accurate white balance overall and slightly better detail when you zoom in. Video time. Both can shoot in 4K at up to 60 frames a second, and the video image looks pretty similar on both in good light, especially when you're filming on that main rear camera. The 14 Pro has a little bit more saturation on the blue channel, but I'd really be hard pressed to tell these two apart if I didn't know which was which. But I find that when I'm shooting at 3x on that telephoto lens, it is a little bit sharper on the newer phone. Let's look at action mode, which is a new stabilization mode that crops in slightly on your image, though it does drop the resolution to 2.8K, and that's really important if you do normally like to film everything in 4K, but I think the results are definitely worth it, especially if you want to film anything involving running, walking, or maybe you want to mount your phone on a bike. Now here is a jogging shot to show you the difference between action mode on the 14 Pro and just regular 4K footage on the 13 Pro. But do make sure to check out more about what action mode can do in our breakout video that's linked in the description. We first saw cinematic mode on the 13 Pro, and it detects when faces or other objects enter the frame, shifting the focus accordingly, kind of like a focus puller would do. You can also adjust the effect after filming by looking at the keyframes and tapping on what you want to switch focus to. You can also adjust the virtual f-stop to control depth of field. The biggest difference in performance here is that the 14 Pro now lets you take cinematic mode in 4K rather than 1080p on the 13 Pro. You can also shoot ProRes video on both phones, but I really hope you have enough storage for that because I definitely don't.
So there you have it. The iPhone 14 Pro clearly has some advantages over the older phone, especially if you want the advantages of that larger 48 megapixel sensor and some of the video tweaks like action mode. But those might not be necessarily worth upgrading just to get those two features, because the iPhone 13 Pro is still an incredibly good camera. Thanks so much for watching. I have put some useful links in the description for you about things like the actual full text comparison. There's also links on where you can find things, including the cases that I was using on the phones in today's video. And you can also hit me up on your favorite social media app with any questions you have about these two phones and their cameras. Until next time, I'll see you later.